welcome to the first of our ASME Megabites. We're presenting this as part of a work stream from the Incubator for Clinical Education Research in collaboration with ASME. Tonight's session, we're looking at engaging allied health professions in clinical education research, and we want to explore with you the barriers, opportunities and enablers to that. I'm Gabrielle Finn, I'm Director of Events for ASME, and I'm the workstream lead at the Incubator. We're going to do some introductions in a moment, just to give you a quick rundown of the plan for the next 90 minutes. So we've got a little bit of housekeeping. We'll then do some panel introductions. We have a few questions just to orientate ourselves and find out who we've got with us. And we'll tell you a little bit about the Incubator in case that's of interest and you want to join some of our activity. We'll then have a panel discussion around some of the big issues facing the community, with some opportunity to go into breakout and have some discussion. We've then got a couple of case studies about some clinical education research within the field, and then we'll do a little bit of a wrap up if that suits people. So in terms of the housekeeping, this is our first Megabite, as I've said, so we're very excited. The session's approximately 90 minutes, so we typically do shorter bite size, which is 60 minutes. But the plan for this one is that it's a little longer to enable lots more interaction. If you want to ask any questions, then please use the chat. You're free to do so. That feature is available by clicking on the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Make sure that you select the option to post the chat to panelists and attendees so that everybody can see that. If we don't get time to answer all of the questions at the time, we will provide a document with all of the answers following the session. We want you to be able to use the chat so that you can contribute to the conversation, but we do have a Padlet as well so that we can load some of those up later on. Just to remind people that the session is being recorded. A video of this webinar will be made available on the ASME website along with any other supporting materials at the end of the session. Closed captions are available during the session, and you can manage this as a participant by clicking on the closed caption button at the bottom of the screen. If you are having any technical issues, then you can contact the ASME team at events@asme.org.uk rather than putting it in the comments. Or just you can let us know. We're quite happy for people to stick your hands up in the air. And then we will share everything again at the end, just so you're clear on how to get in touch with any of us. So I'll start by just doing a quick round of introductions. So as I said, I'm Gabrielle Finn. I'm Director of Events at ASME and the Chair-elect. I am Professor of Medical Education and Associate Vice President for Teaching at the University of Manchester. And then I will hand over to Wendy.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Wendy Wesson. I'm Director of Postgraduate Programmes in the School of Nursing and Midwifery at Keele University. Nurse academic, specialist practitioner in district nursing with a special interest in practice assessment for post-registration education across specialisms and professions, particularly looking at how we support clinical educators. Good to be here.
I think I'm next. My name is Sonia Bussey. I'm the Degree Programme Director for the Masters in Medical Education at Newcastle University. Currently undertaking some research that's being funded by the Incubator as part of their CCORN funding, and also a podiatrist by background. So I've made the transition from podiatry through to med-ed, which was fun.
I am Jo Yin. I am an occupational therapist by profession and a senior lecturer in Brunel University, London. I teach occupational therapy specifically, so I haven't transferred in and out of my profession. I'm still firmly in it. I'm also the chair of the Royal College of Occupational Therapists Learning and Development Board, and I'm completing my PhD on the hidden curriculum of occupational therapy education.
Thank you very much. My name's Alan Williams, and I'm academic lead at the University of Derby in the College of Health, Psychology and Social Care. Background as a registered nurse, 2 decades time served in the NHS, as I call, in emergency care and resuscitation education, and getting on for 2 decades in academia now. I did a professional doctorate, and really that has opened up opportunities for me that I didn't think possible, and we'll maybe go on to talk a little bit about that later on. Thanks for your time.
Great. So we have a Mentimeter that you can use the QR code, or if you go to menti.com, you can add in the code there. So we just have a few questions, and the link is in the chat. We've just got a few questions in order to sort of orientate ourselves to who's in the group and some of the things, some of the challenges that you might be facing within clinical education. I'm just going to stop screen share and switch over to Menti. So the first question that we had, are you registered with, or are you undertaking pre-registration education to become registered with one of the regulatory bodies? There's quite a few, so they're a little bit small, but we've got the GPHC, the General Dental Council, General Medical, Healthcare and Professions Council, Nursing and Midwifery, General Optical, another regulator, or if you're not registered. The next question is, what is your primary profession? Good mix there. Excellent, thank you. Are you currently engaged in clinical education research? Might be people who are thinking about it. (50-50) split so far. The next question is, what's the biggest barrier to engaging with the nursing, midwifery and allied health professions community in clinical education research? So if you are, or you're engaged, or you're thinking about it, we just want to know what sort of challenge you might be facing. I think we definitely have a front runner there with time. All of this certainly resonates. Thank you. And then the converse, in what might be the biggest enabler that you're facing. What's allowing you to engage with the community? Fantastic. Good to see that people are experiencing lots of support within their institutions. I shall just resume. Are those slides visible for people again? Perfect. So just by way of context, I mentioned at the start that we're a group from the Incubator for Clinical Education Research. The Incubator was established in 2020 to develop a sustainable academic workforce in clinical education because the pipeline really has started to dry up. The Incubator has a proposed strategy for the next 3 years to support entry into clinical education careers for novice and early career researchers, with a particular focus on improving access for those in nursing, midwifery, allied health professions and other underrepresented groups. We want to be able to support early career development towards doctoral research where applicable, and ensure sustainability through faculty development to try and expand a network of supervisors, collaborators, and development of a successor body to provide an effective ongoing legacy for the renewal period. If you're interested in finding out more, we have a website. There's also a very active X or Twitter account. On the website, there's lots of materials, including databases of people who are engaged in different types of clinical education research. You can find external examiners if you're looking for it, collaborators, supervisors, like-minded people with different interests through the directory, as well as case studies and all sorts of different materials to help you engage with the community. So I definitely recommend people take a couple of minutes there. In terms of the NMAHP workstream, this has just started in this, what we're sort of onto Incubator 2.0. So in the second iteration, from the NIHR awards up until 2020, only 53 projects were clinical education so that's 4.5% of all of the awards went to clinical education. From those, only 1.5 went to non-medics or people who aren't doctors or dentists. Therefore, we're really trying to raise awareness around clinical education opportunities for students and novice researchers to try and promote the visibility and the denigration of clinical education compared to other academic careers. The goal of this is to really develop and support the community. We're running lots of activities like think tank events, partnering with the Council of Deans for Health. We're trying to ensure that there's effective communication across the professions, including sharing of lots of practitioner-friendly materials. We have some webinar series and different training events like Before the Basics, tailored to pre and post registration professionals. And we've got lots of lots of boot camp activities and things around mastering the basics. This work stream in particular is looking at the moment, we're trying to do a bit of a survey of the landscape to see where we are, what those barriers, enablers and opportunities are. We really want to raise the profile of the NMAHP community. The first part of that is this megabite. And we're really keen to hear from anybody who might want to be involved. So I'll give you an email address at the end of the session if you're interested. One thing we have found so far is that what's in a name is a bit of an issue in terms of whether people use medical education for the field, clinical education, health professions education. So we have a short survey if people are happy to complete it at some point, and we can circulate this following the event just to see what sort of terminology resonates with people, because I do think that could be one of the biggest barriers to getting people into the pipeline is actually they maybe don't identify with the term medical or health professions education. So there's a QR code there and we'll post the link in the chat so that anybody who's interested can complete that survey. It's very short, only about 5 minutes to complete. So we're now going to start with our panel discussion of some of the big issues that we think are facing the community. There is a Padlet here that you're welcome to use if you want. You can use the chat as well, but if you want to post any comments, thoughts as the whole session runs, then you can use the Padlet there for that. So the big issues that we're going to look at tonight is we're going to start with identity and who are we, what is in the name. We're then going to move on to look at some perceptions of priorities. the notion of medics versus everybody else and how the research environment prioritises different groups, and then look at the value of clinical education research. So I'm going to hand over now to Jo-Yin, who's going to talk a little bit, start us off in our panel discussion, thinking about identity within the field and what's in a name. Over to you, Jo-Yin.
Yes, thank you, Gabs. So yeah, the occupational therapist is going to talk about identity and what's in a name, because identity crisis is something that we have grappled with a lot in our profession. I'm not really sure how many people here know who occupational therapists are. I'm very grateful to see that there's definitely more than one occupational therapist on this call. When I saw the profession show up in the word cloud, I was like, oh yeah, I'm not the only one. Thank goodness. So I'm very grateful to the occupational therapists on the call, and for the people who are not occupational therapists. I'm not sure if you know what we do. We don't help people find jobs. We're not occupational health and safety. Occupation is in terms of like how you occupy your time and how you occupy your space. So we are a profession that essentially works together with people whose health challenges are affecting how they occupy their time and space, and also the other way around, how they occupy their time and space, how does it affect their health? So you can see, grappling with names is an issue that I spent a lot of time thinking about, and also, something that I had to spend a lot of time thinking about here, all these different names: medical education, health professions education, clinical education, in the context of my PhD. When I was doing the literature review for my PhD, on the hidden curriculum of occupational therapy education, I just couldn't find very much literature in my own profession, and so I had to branch out. And then I had to decide, what sort of professions I wanted to include in my literature review. Did I just want to focus on health professions alone? Then I realized that, for occupational therapists, we work in health. We also work in social care, and social care is a totally, it is a profession. Social care and social work in some countries, like in Ireland, are regarded as two different professions. Here, I think social work is regarded as part of the care profession. So it's like, yeah, what kind of terminology did I use, when I was doing a broader literature review? Eventually, I decided on health and care professions education, because I thought that was what represented us the best. And I also thought that if we miss out on the literature in social work and social care, because a lot of my work is focused on things like social justice and equality, diversity, and inclusion. If we exclude the social work and social care literature, we're actually doing ourselves a disservice, because there's a lot that we can learn from humanist caring professions like that one, whereas more biomedical, which I think more biomedically oriented professions, can learn from more humanist oriented care professions. So yeah, these are just some thoughts coming from me from an occupational therapist perspective, and I'd really be curious to see, what our other panel members might be thinking as well. Yep.
Alan?
Yes, I think it's what's in the name. This has really exercised me, and my background is in resuscitation, and just talking to Jo-Yin about the what's in the name, and there was an instructor book that used to be called medical education, and that was changed to clinical education, and yet we might need to go further. Would you like me to move on to my slide, or just the thoughts about this first? Yeah
I think some thoughts would be helpful. We've got lots of different professions in the group.
Yeah, so I think, as a registered nurse, obviously one of the largest groups of health professionals, one can say it can dominate the voice. So actually having an OT lead off the discussion, I think, is very useful, and also being the only male on the group there, I think it's good that we've got a female dominated or a high represented group in here. So I think that's important, but it's how we use language, and language is so important that we sometimes don't realize it. I'm sure I do that as well. Wendy, I saw you had your hand up.
Yes, thanks, Alan. I was just going to refer to the fact that even within the professions, we have different specialisms, don't we? So my daughter is an OT in mental health, and many people don't know that exists. So I think, even when people appreciate what an OT is, or a nurse, or a physio, or one of the other professions, the intricacies of what lies underneath that is also lost sometimes. So it's difficult to get a full recognition of who people are and what they actually do within health and care. Sonia has her hand up.
Thanks. I suppose it's a very personal perspective, but until I got involved in medical education, which was almost by accident, I would never have looked at something badged as medical education and thought it would apply to me as a podiatrist. Now that I'm immersed within that world, I'm much more comfortable with using these terms somewhat interchangeably. But I think it's a powerful thing, and I think the difficulty is it exerts that power at the interface between those people that would like to get involved and feel that they're on the periphery, and do they feel that they have a place. And I think unless you can get them over that boundary to see that actually it is for you, that's where the power exists. And I think that's where the problem exists in language that is perceived as being potentially quite exclusionary.
I thought it would be funny to just mention that, I actually have a master's in medical education. Yeah, that's actually the title of my master's, medical education. Yeah. So just to think more deeply about these terms and, what they mean for us as if we want to talk about expanding education research beyond medicine, in the other health and care professions, what does that mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I can see people on this call who I know from the community who are not clinical at all. I trained as an anatomist with a PhD in medical education, and we're not represented. There's no funding streams for us, full stop. So it's it is very exclusionary, and a real challenge, because I think often when people see funding calls or titles of journals, it's a door being closed in the face. We've got Amy, then Alan.
And I think the terms and the identity is important when we work across disciplines with different health professions in clinical education research as well.
Alan?
Yeah, finally I've managed to find my hand on the Zoom, which I'm glad you can't see my, hopefully can't see this. It says online learning on here, but I'm not used to Zoom. I'm going to be a little bit reaction, and maybe we're sweating the small stuff. Are we overthinking it? And actually, should we worry? But I think it is important that we do try and get to some commonality, just so we know what we're talking about. And I think you've examples there. So it's just Gabs was saying about an anatomist and then going into medical education. And for those who are not registered with a regulator, that doesn't devalue what your contribution can be to clinical education. And I use that term, advisedly, I suppose. So I think the survey will be good. Thanks.
Yeah. So shall we move on to our second topic, which is the perception of priorities? So we were looking at how funding, and when we saw that dismal statistic at the start that 1.8% of NIHR funding went to people other than doctors or dentists. Alan, I think you're going to kick us off on this one.
Okay, thank you. So I had a look around the literature in here, and there's a few things on the screen here, but I'm going to talk more around it. I just thought it would be useful to have some figures on the screen there. So NIHR, established in 2006, when I started in academia, actually. So clearly it wasn't high on my priorities. I was just getting my used to higher education after leaving the NHS, the largest funder of health and social care research in Europe. And in 2016, there was a 10-year review undertaken. That was by Mulvey. I can provide the references afterwards. Probably best if I provide them to the coordinator, and then they can be shared with any of the material there instead of blocking the chat out. And there was a review in 2022 by Mulvey of the success rates and of bidding for projects, and we've got the perhaps provocative, I don't think we've got any medics in the room here, but medics versus everyone else, or medics and dentists versus everyone else. I'm not sure if that's But let's just summarize it as that. And is that the true false, and how are different funding decisions made? Well, in this review by Mulvey, which was well prepared paper, I thought, the success rates were not influenced by gender or profession, which I thought was quite interesting. And I'll come on, I've got further comment about that in a moment. But when there was applications from an institution with a medical school, they were 2.6 times more likely to be successful, and that was highly significant. So you start extrapolating, maybe it's a proxy measure or some way of success. And they were looking at the 4,420 applications. I assessed nearly all of those, 99% of them. There were a few that was very small numbers of data missing. And 37% were from doctors, 24% from not health professionals, which I had to read that twice just to get my head around it. Probably refers to the earlier comment about, biomedical sciences, perhaps. 14% from allied health professionals, 13% from other health professionals, and 12% from nurses and midwives. There was no significant difference. But then you start thinking around, well, how many doctors are there registered in the GMC, and how many nurses are registered in the GMC? I don't know if anyone wants to put any comments in the chat of how many they think there is. I'll just leave that quiet for a moment while I progress on, and we'll come back to that. And as I said, there was a home institution of the medical school certainly seemed to was a significant factor. But 71% of the applications either came from the Golden Triangle, and I think I've heard that term before, but Oxford, Cambridge, and some London higher education, and Russell Group universities. So again, quite a small pool. If you think there's 142, I think I counted on the Universities UK, and obviously we're looking at England, so there was about 20. I sort of very roughly counted there, so it was 120. And if you think how many, well, Oxford, Cambridge, and some London, that's Imperial College, or a few of those, and the Russell groups are what, 20, 25. So you've got probably 30 of them, but most of the applications, 71% of the application were coming from that small pool. So how many nurses? And so the Nursing and Midwifery Council, they regulate 808 nurses, midwives, and nursing associates, and of that, 748,000 are nurses. So midwives will make much of the others. Nursing associate are relatively new roles. So, and doctors, there's 375 on the register. So I started thinking, well, hang on, they're still getting more success rate for whatever reasons that might be, and that's probably what we need to think about. And we looked at those a little bit earlier. Reinforcing that point, as other authors, Whitehouse and colleagues were looking at nurse and midwives and AHP represent 2/3 of the health workforce, yet they were only 1%, less than 1%, and 4% of trainees on the NIHR research training infrastructure. So there's a clear imbalance there. And also looking into depth, there was Berkshire and colleagues in Leeds were looking at the perceptions of grants, and essentially one thing that they found when they had in-depth interviews with grants people who had received grants, was that the NIHR awards were transformative, and any other significant, this is not just an NIHR, but I'm sure any other significant awards would be transformative. There was a perception of a biased playing field, like we've alluded to already. There were inequalities perceived by nurses and AHPs, although Mulvey would suggest otherwise, but I think that debate is still there. There's some tensions there. And also those outside established research and unfashionable specialisms felt marginalised. Certainly those need to be support for the NHR promoting research culture, and we've seen that in the Mentimeter earlier, and short-term awards seen as a barrier. And before we start thinking, oh, woe is us in England or in Britain, well, there was work by colleagues and people in France, Ricky and colleagues, and they found a very similar picture, and also in Ghana as well. and also up in northern Norway, where the non-medic projects were seen to be very limited in the early 2000s. There was quite an event to try and increase funding and seem to make a difference. So what can make a difference? And I think that's probably where we want to get onto, and we will in the comment in the panel and also in our breakout rooms. But certainly national, regional and local initiatives do make a difference. I'm involved in one in Nottingham with Nottingham University Hospitals Trust, a Chief Nurse Doctoral Fellowship, and there's many examples across the country with this. So there are potential. We just maybe are at the early stage in the curve. I'll probably hold on that and open up for any comments, thoughts from my colleagues. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Any other thoughts on the perceptions of priorities before we move on to our final big issue? While panelists are thinking, for anyone who's just joined us, we're just going through a quick panel discussion on a few of the big issues before we move into breakouts. There is a Padlet if you've got any thoughts that you want to add to that as well while the session's going, and you're welcome to use the chat. I don't see anyone with anything to add to Alan's rundown of some of the perceptions. I'm going to hand over now to Wendy, who's going to give us a little bit of an introduction to her thoughts on the value of clinical education research. Over to you, Wendy.
Thanks, Gabby. Yeah, so I think we've already established that there is a priority for us to carry out clinical education research that is non-medical as well as medical. Both are of great value, and we need to, I think, to get better at promoting research within the health and care professions by, putting forward bids and research presentations that will get us that recognition. So we need clear recognition of the role of clinical education across the board, and ensure that also that our curricula is reflected and represented and supported effectively across the professions in theory and practice, so that all students and practitioners are appreciative of others' roles. So it not only promotes our own professions, it also enables us to gain a greater understanding of others' roles. I think the future workforce as well need to be aware of and comprehend the contemporary issues in health and social care professions. If we don't do it, who will? And I think one of the things that universities attempt to do across the board is to engage our clinical partners in research. You've raised yourselves the issues there around the time for doing that and having a supportive environment to enable you to spend time within your workloads in engaging in research. It can illuminate so many issues and recognise the challenges for future clinical education. And I feel that the broader the reach across the professions through research, the greater the our understanding of one another's roles and how they impact on one another, will open up opportunities for multi-professional working and learning. It's what we all want to do. It's what we all talk about a great deal, getting a greater understanding of one another's professions and also of where our individual professions are going in the future. So I think, all of the above we've discussed, we've identified the issues, but also we need to find out what the facilitators are and how we overcome those barriers so that we can be really have a greater understanding of our contemporary practice in health and social care. Don't know if anybody's got any comments from the panel or those joining us.
Thanks, Wendy. Any other comments from any of our panelists or any of our attendees? Great, thank you.
I think the future workforce is a really important one, and there was the Council of Deans report in 2017-18, I think it was, about embedding research and scholarship in the curriculum, and I think that's done to varying and different degrees. It's a bit like in my college, there's 3 schools and one of psychologists, and I always joke that they're born to research because they have to get their credits and that, and it's that culture isn't as much embedded in nursing, midwifery and allied health professionals, medics. Yes, it is. Thanks.
Thank you. Joyin?
Thank you, Ellen, for raising that point about how in psychology programs and also in my university as well, it was really interesting that we found that psychology students received extra credit for participating in research. So we were like, maybe we should get our students to do that. What can they get back in return for getting involved in research? In occupational therapy, lately, one of the things that we have started to do is we've started to talk about this. We have a career development framework where we talk about 4 pillars of practice. Professional practice, clinical thing, what you do in professional practice, not necessarily clinical. Again, this term itself also comes with some complications for people working in social care, for occupational therapists working in social care. And I reflect on it. Not all occupational therapists work in clinical settings. So this term, again, we're going back to the name thing. Could be alienating for some. What was I going to say again? I'm sorry. I forgot off on a tangent. Where was I? Can somebody help to remind me where I started off with? Oh, yes. Yep. Practice, facilitating learning, research, and evidence-based practice. And also one more thing is leadership. Yes, our 4 pillars of practice. And, for me, the value or the important part about doing research in, health and care professions education is I think, how are we modeling evidence-based practice to, so for a lot of our students, their very first contact with a registered occupational therapist, with a qualified person, in their own profession, tends to be their own lecturers, and are their lecturers using evidence to teach them? That's the big question out there. I do feel like, and I'll be expanding on this in a case study later, that a lot of the work that we tend to do tends to be guesswork, and how firmly is it embedded in evidence, and then sometimes we have to tell, like for me, I do put a lot of emphasis on it, and having to tell students that what they're asking for is not supported by evidence and such, and having to have these discussions with students is particularly interesting. And I think there is a place, to embed clinical health professions education, research, already in our teaching practice itself, right from the very beginning. Alan's got his hand.
Alan?
Yeah. So it is important, the name. I've just suddenly thought NIHR, National Institute of Health Research. They've retained the acronym, but they did change the name. A year and a half ago, to the National Institute of Health and Social Care Research. They didn't want to change the. So if you look on there, I'm just going to look on now, and I'll stick it. I'll double check. But they kept the acronym for obvious reasons, well established, but they did change the actual, adjust it slightly to include health and social care.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So I've just loaded up the big issues again that we've just discussed, in case anybody who's on the call wants to say anything at this point. Feel free to turn your cameras on, mics on, if anyone wants to raise any points. And if not, then we will transition to breakout.
I wanted to add a point to what Ellen was talking about in terms of priorities, and medicine, being more of a priority. So what I found very interesting was when I started my PhD, I was actually advised to not just work on occupational therapy, but to also incorporate medicine as a comparator group against mine, so that I could stand a better chance of getting published in more established journals, because medical education journals are always more prestigious. I ended up just focusing on occupational therapy. It was too much work to engage the medics. Sorry, medics. I don't know if there are any on the call. But it was very interesting to get this. And I've tried. I work in a university with a medical school, so I've tried to engage with the medical school in many ways. And the medical school our medical school has a very interesting initiative where they said, they've opened up to academics across the across our health sciences department to, which again, social work doesn't like that name, to supervise medical students on a small research project where the students would produce a poster at the end of it. And I put forward something, I put forward actually 3 projects, and they were not focused only on occupational therapy. They were broad, they were interdisciplinary, they were focused on nursing, midwifery, and allied health professions. I put forward 3 projects to the medical school students. There are more than 100 of them. None of them picked my projects. The medical school had been put out so many calls asking people to submit projects. It seems like they really needed projects, but nobody wanted to come on my projects, focus on nursing and allied health professions. So I don't know what this means.
I think you're amongst friends on this call. I'm sure there'll be lots of people who are desperate to collaborate. So
yeah.
Gillian from ASME is going to very kindly put us into breakout rooms. I've put the QR code there for the Padlet, and the link is in the chat if you want to use that while you're in your rooms. And we've got just under 20 minutes, 15 minutes, so just to start to talk about in your group some of the barriers and enablers to research and engagement, how we can be allies to the NMAHP community, and how do we start to cross-fertilise into professional health professions education research and start to build those collaborations. We want to be able to raise the profile of this community, and we want to be able to petition the funders to take this research more seriously. So it'd be really good to get you all chatting amongst yourselves. So Gillian, I shall hand over to you I'm going to stop sharing the screen so that we can all see each other, and hopefully we'll be able to magically go into breakout.
Okay, I wonder if we should pause the recording.
You're muted, Gabs.
Technological issues. We were going to just have a very quick summary from our breakout rooms, just as sort of a rapid line or two from a host. In our room we were talking, we had a lot about some of the challenges around protected time, and prestige came up, and the value of clinical education research. We had some really good ideas about doing better socialising and marketing and using case studies and stories to demonstrate value, and particularly thinking about who deems what worthy, and how do we show the link between the education research that we do in undergraduate and postgraduate environments and patient outcomes, and that by having more collaborative interprofessional research, it will positively inform patient outcomes. We talked about a lot, but and the challenges around PhD funding and wages for clinical colleagues not being included as part of that. Sonia, maybe do you have something from your room?
Yes, so in a very similar way, we talked about barriers. We talked about the barriers of time, busy caseloads, isolation, professional isolation, that you're often the only person with that role in a particular place, and the transferability between different organisations, institutions, jobs can be challenging because you start again. Enablers, absolutely conversations with the right people. There could be a fantastic opportunity next door, as one of the participants had mentioned, but unless you know about it, it's inaccessible to you. So sometimes these things happen opportunistically rather than in a formulated way. And I would absolutely echo what you said about examples from practice. We heard some really good examples from practice from departments where these things have been done really well, and maybe sharing some of those strategies would be helpful.
Great, thank you very much. Do we have a host from another room that could give us a
Yeah, there was it's Alan here. There was Joy Yu and a couple of colleagues in there, and we had really a wide-ranging discussion around supporting and the sort of main three themes, and I'll hand over briefly to my colleagues. But one, nurture your identity, so know where you want to go, and by doing that, be involved in things. So whether that's reviewing for journals or other sort of organisation, and I've got a blog that I'll share the link to that I wrote for the Research Council, because had I not paid for an instructor course 30 odd years ago and the rest, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now. And it's that sort of link and taking opportunities, the serendipity, just like Sonia said, in that way. And the interdisciplinary and work nature of work, and actually how Michael, one of the people in our room, has a philosophy background, yet is working in a medical school, and mindfulness, and Leanne has a very rehab background, and that again was mediated by the culture of the systems where she was abroad, overseas. So it's just grabbing these opportunities. I'll share the link to this. Thanks.
Great. And Wendy, I think yours was the final room.
Thanks, Gabby. Yeah, so we talked about sometimes one of the barriers is that it can be a tokenistic contribution. So somebody might say, oh, it'd be a good idea to have an OT feedback to us, and that being tokenistic, as opposed to them really wanting those views and really engaging at an early stage, coming in at the back end of a piece of research rather than being involved from the start, was seen as a barrier. When it works, when enablers are, when you're asked to engage, when it's understood what the profession can offer, and why you're there and why you're making a valuable contribution to that research. So we sort of need to change also the perception. It was felt within the group of educational research as being really important, as opposed to scientific research being the priority. We also talked about the interprofessional education, and that actually there's no issue with collaboration in practice. The issues arise when we talk about professions as allied. So the fact that we need to recognise those professions, who they are, what their titles are in their own right, rather than the AHP, which wasn't particularly favoured as a term. And there were lots of examples within the group of being engaged in service improvement type opportunities, which really engaged people and could see the value of them. The issue being, again, time, and allocation of time, recognition of the importance of that within the working day and the working week. So some enablers, some barriers, lots of discussion.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'm going to move us on now to our case studies. So we have two for you, just to give some examples of some great practice within clinical education research. So I shall hand straight over.
Okay, thank you, Gabby. So yes, this is my case study. I just had a bit of reflection as I was working on my PhD, thinking, okay, what sort of case study do I want to present? And I thought it would be good to talk about, the hidden curriculum, so to speak. So what is the hidden curriculum? When I in the context of my PhD, I have defined it as, the gap between what we teach and what the students learn, because a lot of the time in health and care professions, people have a do as I say, not necessarily do as I do kind of thing. And this is also related to the sentiments that I raised earlier about how, if we don't do research on education within our professions, how are we modeling evidence-based practice, right? So again, do as I say, not as I do. And what the thing about the hidden curriculum is that it is really influenced by many variables, and it fluctuates between contexts. So there has been research showing that even when you have a shared explicit curriculum, that is the written curriculum, the formal written curriculum, and you put it in, and this research was conducted in 2 different medical schools, one in the Middle East and one somewhere in the West. And then you ended up with really different outcomes because of the influence of the hidden curriculum. When I did allied health professions research, and there are 15 allied health professions in the UK, one of the things that I did was I started talking to the representatives from the various royal colleges or the various professional bodies. And what I learned was that, each of the allied health professions has their own very distinct professional culture. So like occupational therapists, we have a mixture of biomedical and humanist backgrounds, but then you have some professions which are very biomedical, podiatrists, physiotherapists, osteopaths. And even among these professions, there are distinct differences. Like I spoke to the CEO of the osteopathic organization, and he was and he educated me a little bit about the history of osteopathy. And I was like, oh, this used to be a profession only for the nobility, and royalty. So, the kind of cultures that they've developed are a little bit different from, say, physiotherapy, which my own students say have a very sporty or kind of jock culture, so to speak. So, and then you have professions which are very, women dominated, especially here in the UK, so there's a lot of quite feminist culture in there, quite feminist approaches in terms of the way people behave and such, and that shapes the culture of the profession. So when I looked into the hidden curriculum of occupational therapy, it was essentially because I was looking to address educational inequalities. My institution particularly had a keen interest in addressing the ethnicity of voting gap. Why is it that students from Black and Asian racially minoritized backgrounds, when they come into the same institution and go through the same programs, the same curriculum, and all the factors are controlled for, they came in with the same grades, but they graduate with different grades? Why is that? Yeah. So a lot of the literature about the hidden curriculum was actually on these sorts of issues, race particularly, was conducted in predominantly white institutions. So there wasn't anything suitable for my institution, which incidentally has in our occupational therapy programs, up to 50% of the cohort might not be white, or even more. In recent years, we've had cohorts where white students are approximately 30%. So that's 60+%, which do not identify as white and racially minoritized. And at the time when I was conducting this study, actually our staff body, which is again is very rare in the UK, approximately 60% of our staff were not white. So it was really interesting to see when I did that research around the hidden curriculum of race, the findings were that even though population-wise, we were not very white, there was a diverse representation, but the curriculum itself, was using a colorblind or color evasive approach, and it was still very white. So that started, that was the first study of my PhD, and then I started to go down different rabbit holes, and then, we need to look at practice placements, based on that study. Okay, we need to look at practice placement. And I also looked at the hidden curriculum in terms of co-producing research with my own master's students, which I'd been supervising, how co-producing research on education, on occupational therapy education, was challenging because they were raising things like, oh, it's really difficult working together with a supervisor who is also working together with us as a teammate, and it's not really something that university prepares you for, or such. So what I've learned while working on my PhD, and I've been in academia for 8 years, I've been in relatively senior academic leadership positions. Back in my home country, I used to be head of an occupational therapy school, and then, like I said, now, I've actually managed to, become the chair of the Royal College of Occupational Therapists Learning and Development Board, becoming a fellow with the Council of Deans of Health, where I've had the privilege of attending meetings together with the deans of the nursing, midwifery, and allied health profession schools, and just listening to how people talk about, how decisions are made. And what I've learned is that, wow, there's a lot that, I mean, I don't know. And, I think on this call, compared to some of the other panelists, I am perhaps, relatively inexperienced, but I also think, that a lot of health professions, health and care professions educators, I don't know, I'm not necessarily able to speak about social work and social care because they're not necessarily in the circles that I mingle with. But I think in the health professions, at least the health professions, a lot of the times people are operating on guesswork, because we just don't have that evidence that is specific to our professions. So which brings me back to the question, how can we model to our students evidence-based decision making if the evidence we have relevant to our profession is so sparse? Yeah. So I think that there is a lot that we can do within our professions, to do better. And also, I think, as part of the conversations that I've had in my little breakout room just now, it was also in terms of cross-fertilization. What is the value that perhaps people from non-health backgrounds bring, to the table? In the school where I teach, we've previously had challenges where students say, they don't like being taught by people who are not occupational therapists. But perhaps what could they benefit from learning, from people who are not occupational therapists? These are some of the questions that are really interesting, and that we can perhaps put forward for people to think about. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'll move us on to our second case study. Oh, once my slide decides it wants to progress. There we go. Over to you, Wendy.
Thank you, lovely. Thanks, Gabby. So what I wanted to really talk about was what I did in my first element of research when I was undertaking that for my doctorate in education has really funneled through the rest of my academic career and has gained traction in some areas and opened up to other professions beyond nursing. So I looked at assessment of higher level practice in nursing and looked at what we should be doing as higher education institutions to support practice assessors. But this has now developed into how can we support enhanced clinical practitioners, how can we support advanced clinical practitioners, etc. So, what was found within this study is very applicable to the other professions. And I think that's the important thing to remember is that, there are various ways of having impact. They're not necessarily always publishing. Often it is feeding that evidence back into the curriculum so that we are enabling the next generation, as I said earlier, of clinicians and of researchers. So this was a grounded theory study, and the reason it was a grounded theory study was, as with a lot of these studies, we operated from ground zero. So there's very little evidence that underpinned this particular subject. So in order to carry out the research, I carried out interviews with practice assessors, but also carried out focus groups with academics, so I could combine and compare the results of those, the feedback that I got from both. And the outcomes of that were really also resonating in the discussions that we've had today, in that many of those practice assessors found their roles to be, as practice assessors, central and integral to everything that they do. It's important for them to be educationalists in clinical practice. So we, as educationalists in higher education institutions, were completely in support of them. However, their managers did not necessarily recognise that role as, a primary role within their working day. So we had to really demonstrate that vital role. Whilst this was happening, unfortunately, the Nursing and Midwifery Council decided to remove some standards, the Standards for Learning and Assessment in Practice, and replace them with SSSA, Standards for Support for Practice Assessors and Practice Supervisors. Now, as a result of that, we have a more level playing field. The problem with that was that it also meant that a lot of educational institutions decided to remove or stand down their specific programs because there was no longer a requirement for these practice assessors and practice supervisors to have PG certs in clinical education. So one of the things I've been doing, certainly since I've been at Keele for the last 4 years, is really trying to promote a return to developing clinical educators outside of medical practice. And one of the things that we've done is developed a module that will sit in the PG Cert ClinEd that's specifically for nurses, midwives, and other, I don't want to say it now, allied health professions. I feel bad saying that term, but those others, very important professions that sit within clinical practice. So it was certainly the research that was undertaken fed back into the curriculum development that we undertook to ensure that we got support mechanisms for all of those practice assessors, and that we really recognised what support they needed in practice to undertake those roles. It also was incorporated into the Queen's Nursing Institute practice teacher standards, so that those standards clearly identify the importance of those clinical education roles, and has had a wider reach in terms of wider discussions with our colleagues in other professions in order to make sure that we recognise that the role requires our practice assessors to not only identify that individuals are competent in the workplace, but also are capable of adapting those skills to other workplaces, so that they can actually be lifted up and dropped elsewhere and still feel capable of undertaking their roles and being particularly competent in doing those. The professional identity element was hugely important, recognising their professional identity as practice assessors as well as specialist practitioners in their particular area of practice. And one element of that was reflecting and learning together. So again, as part of the curriculum development, we were pulling in practice assessors to ensure that they could support and learn together, and also facilitate students to do that same critically reflective learning. So really, my case study was intended to identify the fact that it's so important that we have practice assessors out there, but also to illustrate that it doesn't stop at the end of that piece of research. It continues on into other areas, which is what's happened subsequently. Oh, hello. Thank you, Gabby. I think we're running out of time, so I'll leave it there.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'm going to hand over to Sonia, who's just going to give us a couple of take-home points, and then I'll close up with a couple of final points of housekeeping, if that's okay. Over to you, Sonia.
Thanks, Gabs. It's been such an interesting session, and I'd like to thank everybody for contributing in the way that you have in such a candid way. I think what we can agree on is that we kind of can't agree. It's the golden question, isn't it? That if we knew the answer to all these things, how do we make things better, then we'd kind of be there already. I think the way forward seems to be that we need to keep listening, we need to keep watching, seeing what's happening, learning from one another, trying to foster those conversations and create forums such as this. I mean, what a wonderful opportunity this has been today to bring people together with that like-minded attitude to consider how we might develop and share and grow and promote this really interesting area of research to a wider audience. So it's lovely to see so many people here from such different backgrounds. And I would like to see, I'm not quite sure how we do it, but I would like to see a way of continuing this conversation, because I think there's been the start of such interesting kernels of potential opportunities that we could take forward in terms of sharing that good practice and developing that community. And I would certainly from my perspective, please do encourage people to look at the incubator and to become involved. It's a budding community already, and we could only enhance that. So do have a look at that.
Fantastic, thank you, Sonia. So we have the Twitter account on the screen there and the website. If people want to join this work stream, you could drop Lee Denley at Newcastle, who's the incubator administrator, an email. We meet monthly. and the more the merrier. We're happy to have anybody join that group. I'll just leave that QR code there for a second if anybody is interested in doing the survey for us. The next incubator event is Mastering the Basics Research Training. So there are you can register for 1 or 2 days, and there's a sort of a Dragon's Den style training in terms of building up applications for funding. And then I shall bring this part to a close. So just to thank everybody for participating today. It was great to see so many of you and so many people staying for the full 90 minutes. A huge thanks to our panelists and to the ASME team for all of their support. We will have a video available on the ASME website within the next few days. And if you enjoyed this megabite, so the bigger session, there is a free bite size coming up on faculty empowerment for academic training, presented by Professor Shivaska and chaired by Sarah Edwards, who's the Honorary Secretary of ASME. So that will run on Monday the 13th of May between 1 and 1:45, and you can find more details on the ASME website under the events tab. Please do continue the conversation with us. You can find us all on Twitter, email addresses. We'd love to hear more. We hope that you'll join our work stream and have a pleasant evening. Thank you, everybody.